Welcome, everybody. This podcast was inspired by a teacher I met at the start of this term who was English as a second language. And she said her biggest struggle as a new immigrant to Australia was all the acronyms and abbreviations in special education. I thought, wow, how true is that? I've been doing special education for so long that I'd forgotten we use so many acronyms and abbreviations that can be confusing for families who are new to a diagnosis. So I have made a cheat sheet of all the acronyms and abbreviations that you'll see, particularly around children with autism spectrum and neurodiversity. I did start making a bigger list. Well, I started off making a list that ended up being enormous with all the abbreviations we use in education. It just got too big. So I thought I would just narrow it down to a one-pager that I recommend you print out. Schools, please share with families. This would be very important to have in your IEP document. See, there's an acronym, our individual education plans, but every state has different words, TAs for teacher assistants or SLSOs. I didn't even get into all the different staff acronyms. This is just the key things that you will need. So I hope you can print it out and share it with families, friends, anybody else who would find it helpful. But in thinking about that, I thought, what else would you need to understand? And one of the things is to remember that there is still no set way to use whether it's autistic child or child with autism. It's a personal preference. So please remember when you're talking to families or people on the spectrum or young adults on the spectrum or teens, ask them what they prefer. There are some people on the spectrum that still prefer the term Asperger's, and we need to respect that. The way I look at it, and those of you who have been to my workshops recently, the way I explain it is my birth name is Susan. And if I go to Medicare or to the airport or get a passport, they want to use the name Susan. I personally do not like the name Susan. I prefer to be called Sue. So even though the diagnostic term might be autism spectrum disorder, we need to respect families and children's wishes about what they would like to be used. And that can change, just like, in fact, some of you who may know me know that my husband refers to me as Susie because his mum's name is Sue, and that makes two Sue-Larkies in his family. But so many of you, I'd love you to think, is there a name you don't like being called? Have you got a personal preference? Do you get cross if you ask people to use that preference and they change it to something else? Like, is your name Emily and you don't like being called Ems? Have a think what works for you, and then respect that for people with neurodiversity, they may have a preference and that preference can change as well. So because we're talking about diagnostic, I thought we'd do a throwback to an old episode 110, with the wonderful Emily Hanlon, who is a psychologist, because I'm not a psychologist. I don't diagnose children. I love what Tony Attwood says. Without a diagnosis, children are judged. With a diagnosis, they can be supported. But I thought we would look at this episode because in this episode, way back at episode 110, Emily goes through all the common confusions and misunderstandings and helping us understand labels like level 1, level 2, level 3. What is the difference between ODD and PDA? What is the difference with ADHD versus ASD? She does a deep dive into understanding that and understanding the complexity of diagnosis. I'm very excited. I have Emily booked in to come on a podcast next term to talk about how educators and schools can talk to families about getting a diagnosis. I am hearing from more and more early childhood and early, primary schools, early like kindy, prep, year 1, year 2, of children who are waiting for diagnosis, who teachers are unsure how to talk to families about diagnosis, because often with COVID, children were home for 2 years. We weren't sure if the behaviour was because of the disruption and anxiety around COVID, or whether we needed to seek a diagnosis. So I thought, who better than Emily to get back on the podcast to share her insights and understanding about how to talk to parents about diagnosis, what we should be looking for, are there checklists? So keep an eye out on my Facebook page for my question collection around that. That will be in October because Emily's taking the whole of October off. So I've booked her in for the end of October to do the interview. So even if you're listening to this after, in a year's time, look for that episode. I think it'll be invaluable about how to talk to families about getting and carers about getting a diagnosis for their child. So please check your inbox for my emails with this one-page PDF cheat sheet. It's beautiful. It's all colourful and lovely for you to print out. Print it out, share it with other people. I also, if you haven't got my email, check your spam. I know I say it every 10th podcast, but so many people email me going, I can't find it, but just whitelist me. Make sure you get all my emails. You don't have to read all of them. I'm happy for you to just read every 5th one, but I would recommend this as one you print out and download and have as an easy reference. Hope you find it helpful. Let me know if I've missed out any key ones. I can always alter it and add more in along the way. I'm sure it's something that I'll update every year and reshare with my beautiful community. Thank you for being part of this community. Hi everyone, welcome to the Sue Larkey podcast. As I always say, you have to embrace difference to make a difference. Let's dive into today's podcast. I am absolutely thrilled to have Emily Hanlon on the podcast today to help us all understand autism, common confusions and misunderstandings. Emily is a psychologist and the daughter of the wonderful Rhonda, who I interviewed in podcast episode 107 about what you can do to increase inclusion for Autism Awareness Month. Emily's brother has autism and she did her clinical masters on wellbeing of siblings of children with ASD compared to children with typically developing siblings, which we hope to do a podcast on in the future. And I will link to the research in the podcast notes. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So excited for you to share. I mean, I know I meet teachers and parents and even people on the spectrum who really don't understand what all these labels and words mean. So I'm hoping that you as a psychologist can help us sort of unpack and understand when a teacher gets a report, what a lot of these things mean. So
Absolutely.
Can you give my listeners some labels, diagnostic terms that they might hear and explain what they mean?
Sure. So when a child gets a diagnosis of autism, they're given a level of functioning. So there's 3 levels, which in my opinion probably isn't enough to cover like the broad spectrum of individuals that do present with autism, but it's what we've got. So it's what we've got to go with. And just as a side note, I know a lot of families aren't thrilled on that labeling system as well. But again, it's what we've got. So it's just something I guess that we have to work with. So you get a level from 1 to 3. Level 1 is more your high functioning autism. So I guess people with a level 1 diagnosis would probably have formerly have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Then you've got level 2, which is moderately functioning. So they can still do quite a lot of things. My brother is classified as level 2. So he can, for example, catch public transport by himself and he's verbal and all of that, but he does really struggle and he's in supported employment roles and that sort of thing. Whereas level 3 is what we classify as severe. Often, but not always, people with a level 3 diagnosis are nonverbal. They have severe difficulties with communication, self-care and behaviour.
Yeah, and I liked that you've said that actually level 3, because I hate the words high, low functioning, severe, and I'm sure you do too, because
Absolutely.
when I get to know the child or the person, that label doesn't really fit with what I know about them.
Yeah, for sure.
And I always say, look, I think that's a starting point, but you need to get to know. And I I know when I was at uni, we did that old self-fulfilling prophecy where if you think a child is low functioning, well, that's where you're going to pitch things. And I've worked with kids who have limited communication who are super bright. So
absolutely. It's a really challenging, as a psychologist, I find it really difficult because that's the terms that, we're trained to use. But as a sibling, I know that that's not always the case. And I know that in some areas, my brother's level 1, in some he's level 3, and in some he's level 2. It doesn't fit everything, it doesn't fit his presentation properly.
Exactly. And I think that's what I struggle with as an educator, because sometimes as a teacher, I'll have a student who's like amazing in one area and we could call them high functioning, and in another area, probably low functioning. Or one area impacts on all the other areas, like communication. So how do you evaluate a child if they have limited communication? It's very hard in a testing with a psychologist to actually know where that child's at. So I like to call it their functional label. So how do they function in a busy classroom, or how do they function in employment? Like how does that functionality look at home or school and impact on their learning and therefore provide support? But the problem is when we get these levels, that often leads to the support. And I meet teachers all the time who struggle with that. So I think we're on the same page. And
Definitely.
For everyone listening, we all struggle with these terms, but it's good to have an idea when you get that report when it says level 1, 2, 3, what it means. So thank you for that.
No worries.
The other thing I get a lot of inquiries about, and more kids getting this ODD and PDA diagnosis. Can you give us a little bit of insight in that?
Sure. So ODD, so oppositional defiance disorder, is a diagnosis in which a child is characterized by like defiant and really disobedient behavior, primarily towards authority figures. So not so much their peers, more so people in authority. The cause is actually unknown, but it likely involves a lot of genetic and environmental factors rather than like a biological core issue. And I think the biggest factor when it comes to ODD is that it is environmental. So a lot of the work is actually done with parents. Like, yes, individual therapy will focus on the child, but a lot of the work is done to modify the environment to make sure that child can thrive. So I guess in that regard, it differs from autism because it's purely behavioral, whereas, kids with autism have difficulties in other areas like speech, sensory difficulties, food fussiness, communication, and so on. So if you simplify it and break it down, ODD is more so behavioral, whereas autism is a lot more than that.
Yeah. And what about this PDA then?
So PDA is not necessarily like a diagnosis of its own. It's so pathological demand avoidance. It's more like a behavioral profile that describes people whose main characteristic it is to avoid everyday demands and expectations to a really extreme extent. So obviously a lot of kids are going to be a little bit defiant in some areas, but this is like quite extreme. And so how PDA differs from autism is that it's a behavioral profile. It's not an additional diagnosis. So a child can be diagnosed with autism with a PDA profile, but would not be diagnosed with PDA as such.
Right. So this is what's so confusing, right?
Yeah, it is.
So confusing.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I've taught students, PDA I've only started hearing about in the last couple of years, but when I worked at the autism school, we had a lot of students with a dual diagnosis of ASD and ODD. And without a doubt, the ODD had the biggest impact on learning.
Absolutely.
So the ASD was important, but the ODD just impacted everything. And you really had to come from everything from the ODD and work very closely with the families. In fact, I'm still good friends with most of those families because when you're working with an ODD child as a teacher, we have to be on the same page and be consistent and also really honest. I just found if parents text me going, he's had a really bad morning, I knew what to get out that morning to support.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's so important. Like that communication between schools and families is so important. And I think sometimes it can get a little bit like us versus them. And it just shouldn't be that way because, I do that even with my 10-month-old son. I tell the daycare, I'm like, oh, he didn't sleep well tonight. Good luck. It's just all about that open communication.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said the good luck because one of my mums, who I still am a good friend with, she's so funny. She'd text me and go, turning off my phone, good luck today,
So true. That's my type of mum.
Yeah. And that humour is so important, and
Oh, yeah.
honesty, and that honest humour I just found.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and actually that little ODD boy had a really good sense of humour, and
Okay.
I found that one of the most important things. He often didn't deliver it with the humour. He'd deliver it in a tone of voice that you could misinterpret, but once
Yeah.
I got to know him, I knew there was a lot of humour in his things that he would say to me. So, yeah,
It's so funny.
not easy. And I think in a busy classroom, it is really hard because those kids, I find often, if, as you say, they're often good with their peers, but as soon as you put a demand on them, they start reacting. And that's where I found over building a good relationship with their peers was actually a really important strategy.
Absolutely. So important.
And my little boy, he had a roster of who sat with him, and we called it his appointment book. And so he didn't burn out his peers, and he'd rotate who he was with. And I had times in the day where he was the teacher, and he got to be like helping children with their work, and then were other times that children helped him, and times when they're at a similar level. But I found that worked really well, where he got to be the authoritarian figure sometimes, and got to be
awesome.
he was really good at reading, so he was like he collected the readers every day and marked off who'd read, and then he would run the reading groups, and that just built his self-esteem. And
absolutely.
Yeah, but I had to rotate who he was with, because he just strategies would wear out really fast with him. And that's what I think can be so tiring for parents and professionals, that things only work for a little while with our ODD and PDA kids because of their anxiety. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think as well that comes down to, like, a lot of the time those inclusion strategies that, to no fault of their own, teachers are trying to implement because that's what they know or that's what they've been told, often accidentally become like exclusion strategies, and that child actually becomes excluded when the whole aim of that strategy was to try and, filter them back into the classroom or get them involved. And it's quite funny how quickly that can happen. And it's a really tricky balance, I guess.
Yeah, and I have some students who don't want to go out with a teacher assistant.
Yeah.
We know that they need a little bit of one-on-one support, and that can be really hard for my teacher assistants, because they perceive their job is to take that child out and work with them, but that child doesn't want to go, particularly as they head into secondary, and if they've got a little bit of ODD or PDA, well, you can't have a little bit, but if they are, that behaviour and the hormones and teenage, and sometimes we have to accept that they don't want to be excluded, and they're seeing it as exclusion.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get back to our terms. Sorry, I knew this was going to be hard to stay on track, Emily. Sorry, everybody. Emily's a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so excited to sort of chat to her about these things. So it's wonderful to have a psychologist to bounce ideas off. Now, what about ADHD and ASD? What's the difference there?
So this one I think is probably the trickiest to decipher, because a lot of kids present with both diagnoses, and a lot of the time, yes, a child can have both diagnoses, but I think a lot of the time they're given both, and it's not overly necessary. And I know that can be controversial, but I think a lot of the time kids are diagnosed as autistic and with ADHD, and it's probably more the autistic behaviours that can and symptoms that are covering both diagnoses. But to that being said, you definitely do have kids that present with both. So they, like I said, they can look really, really similar. They can both have problems focusing, be impulsive, have difficulties with communication. But I guess when you're trying to look at what's what, it's all about what's causing the behavior. So if you look at the example of turn taking, that's a good one. So kids with ADHD may not be able to stick to turn taking, but they understand what turn taking is. Whereas kids with autism don't necessarily have the understanding of what it means to turn take and need to actually be taught at a basic level what that is. And again, like a kid with ADHD might not respond to their name when it's being called. That doesn't mean they don't know what their name is. That's just a bit of inattention. Whereas a child with autism may not recognize their name initially and understand what that means. So the behavior is exactly the same, but you really don't know what you're looking at until you delve down into what the cause of that behavior is.
Oh my goodness, Emily. I wish I had heard that 30 years ago. You have just summed up in 2 minutes what I have experienced for years, but wasn't able to explain as well as
It's a
you.
tricky rhyme.
That is so good. I love that. I absolutely love, because it's so true.
Yeah.
Like in my early years book, I explain why you have to teach turn taking to a child with autism. Because often early educators will go to me, well, why do I need to teach? It's like, because they have no idea.
They go, fly straight over their head. You might as well try and teach a 5-year-old algebra.
Because they are so happy playing on their own. Why would they want to share it? Like, and they like control and routine, and someone else coming in is not going to work on that.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
I'm not going to start with their favorite toy to teach turn taking because we're better off starting something that actually never played with if we want to teach turn taking. Whereas you're right, the inattention, which is like when I'm doing group work in a classroom, that some of my children with autism are just best with a partner, because the more kids, the harder the social and the waiting, right? But a child with ADHD, the reason I might do a partner is because they just can't wait for their turn.
Exactly. And I think that's the trickiest thing, like, because the behaviors are exactly the same in a lot of aspects. And if you don't like understand this and delve down to the core of it, it's really tricky to to decipher what's what. And that's to know no one is at fault for that, because I actually explained this to someone yesterday. I studied at uni for about 7 years in total across all the degrees, and in that 7 years in a psychology degree, I did 1 hour on autism, and that was an elective for a child development subject. So if me, a clinical psychologist, has only studied autism for 1 hour, how can we expect, every teacher to have a proper understanding when it's not part of their, big curriculum and that sort of thing? So it's no one's fault. It's just like we just need to get that information out there.
Wow, Emily. Yeah. Because, that's the same for educators, for teachers. So
absolutely.
Teachers can do elective of special ed, but they're not just doing autism. They're doing
exactly.
ADHD, autism, cerebral palsy, muscular, like every disability.
Yeah.
And that's what happened to me too. I learned what it is, not what to do. So
exactly.
But I didn't realise in 7 years you did 1 hour.
1 hour. And it was an elective child subject. So it's ridiculous. Wow. And I always say everything I know about autism, I'd be like, gone out and learnt myself, or I've lived through my own family and that sort of thing. So and that's what I say to families as well when it comes to choosing a therapist. Don't just assume that your therapist knows about autism. You need to find someone that goes and puts their hand up and says, no, I've gone out and I've done more work to help your family.
Yeah. And this is, look, I'm sure for families and teachers listening too, that so often we notice a child is different and need to go send for a diagnosis, but then for parents to go to the right person, and dare I say, going back to the ADHD, I've sent kids off for diagnosis that I know are autism and they come back with ADHD.
I know.
And that is really hard because it costs the parents a lot of money. And
absolutely.
why would they go back for another diagnosis when a professional just told them? So as a teacher, should I be trying to direct parents to people that I know have an expertise in ASD, or because we often don't want to say the word? So how do I approach that? How do I approach it?
So I would always say a lot, like, look, 80% of the time I would say that parents have an inkling that something's going on. And for that 20% of the time, obviously that conversation can be really, really difficult to have. So always obviously be mindful that one of two things can happen. It could be the first time that they're hearing this and it may come as a real shock and they may be in denial, or they may say, we're waiting for this conversation to happen. And I think a lot of the time it's not until kids, especially girls, are quite good at masking. So I think sometimes it's not till kids get to that formal education setting that the real difficulties and the difference between them and their typically developing peers may, start to arise. But I'm always a firm believer, though, of letting parents know what the child is doing well, no matter how small. So even if you're like, this child is like, I'm going home every night crying about how to help this child, please also tell the parents a list of positives as well. I will never forget I went to this one parent-teacher interview with a family who asked me to go, and they sat there for about half an hour. We said nothing, just telling us all the things that this kid's not doing right, how he's failing, how he's behind his peers. And I said, oh, sorry, would you, we've spoken a lot about how, poorly he's doing. Can you just tell us what he's doing right? He's got to be doing something right. And they all looked at each other and they were like, what do you mean? And I was like, no, tell us. And they didn't have it.
Stop.
Yeah, it was honestly horrible. And I honestly was so thankful that I was there, because the mum was in tears. It was horrible. So no matter any interaction that you have, I would always say, please. And, as being a sibling as well, I've been to all my brother's parent teachers and stuff and I only remember the words of one where they told us how amazing he was. And that's what resonated with me. And that's what made us want to work with the school. If you're always telling parents what's wrong, they don't, they're always going to come to those meetings.
No good relationship comes from negatives.
Absolutely.
The psychologists say it's 4 positives to 1 negative.
For sure.
And I am always mindful of that, and sort of making me a bit teary, because I'm remembering about a beautiful little boy I had at the autism school called Ricky, who I adored, absolutely loved. But he was an identical twin, and his twin was actually twice exceptional, gifted and talented. And Ricky had limited communication, hand flapper and toe walker, and classic autism, you call it, right? And his mum came in for the parent-teacher interview. So it's just in prep or reception, kindy, whichever state you're listening. And so he's 5 years of age. And I said to his mum, Carol, I love Ricky. He is so cute. I love the way he flaps his hands and his feet. And she just started crying. She said, Sue, no one in my family has ever loved my son.
Oh, my God.
All I hear is, why is he different to his brother?
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
It's horrible.
And I still get teary, because every time I think of that story, I'm back in that classroom, because I was just doing who I am, which is seeing the positives and the glass half full, right? And for her, it was the first time in her life, and we had the most fantastic relationship. I actually became really good friends with her, because
awesome.
I was a person in her life who actually saw the positives, and it just builds. And, for teachers listening, just taking that moment to point out the smallest thing. Yeah. So many of my families are so used to being defensive.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
It takes a while for them to hear the positives. So,
yeah, absolutely. And that's what I always say. If a family's coming to you and comes off really defensive, don't take it personally. Just remember that this is probably the 500th meeting that they've gone to, and they're assuming they're about to be attacked. But it's like literally a defense mechanism.
Absolutely. And it's the biggest complaint with NDIS too, because it's all a deficit. It's all the things your child can't do.
Yeah.
And that is, I'm all about begin with the end in mind. What are we building towards?
Absolutely.
Where are we going with this? What are the things we can do to give this child long-term skills and outcomes, and, like your brother, end up in supported employment and live his best life? All of us need to live our best life. So I understand parents' frustration with NDIS. It's all about the deficit. And I know we have to fund based on that, but there should be part of that that's about, hey, here are all the positives too.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not wrong.
That is exhausting. Anyway, we've gone off track. But this was about common misconceptions, and that is a big common misconception.
Yeah, it is. It is, for sure.
And teachers listening probably have reports coming up in the next 3 or 4 months, and I'd love them to make sure, even in that parent comment, the teacher comment, to make sure it is full of all the good things that have happened, because for me that is so important. Okay, so I know one of the biggest challenges we have is the kids who slip under the radar, the kids who we can't get diagnosed. So can we just have a little touch on that? Because I know I meet teachers every week who are like, I don't know what to do, Sue. They haven't got a diagnosis. What do I do?
So if a child hasn't got a diagnosis, I think that the number one thing is really, really obviously trying to push for the family to go get external support, to get a second opinion, especially with girls, because a lot of girls go off for a diagnosis and come back with the diagnosis of like anxiety. Yeah. Which is frustrating. So I would also say, if your school has like a school counselor or a school psychologist, definitely get some supports from them. And also I think the biggest thing is, and I know it can be time consuming for teachers who have, 20 to 30 kids in the classroom, sometimes even more, but sometimes just taking some time to fill out like a bit of a data sheet and collecting data can really open your eyes to exactly what's going on. So again, a lot of the times you might think that a child is just throwing pens across the room to be really, really naughty. But once we take a step back and we gather some data, we can see that was actually maybe their attempt to interact with another peer, but the peer was ignoring them, so they threw more pencils. And it wasn't until all the pencils were on the floor that everyone turned around and gave him attention. So it's all about, I'm a big believer with, you do not have to agree with behavior at all. You can hate the behavior, but you absolutely 100% of the time always need to empathize with the emotion that is underlying that behavior, because that behavior is happening for a reason, and you cannot expect to change that behavior if you don't know why.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that pencils is a classic example.
Yeah.
And many of my kids who slip under the radar, it is because they're sort of half getting it right like their peers. So other peers throw a pencil to get attention and then they don't get caught. But this kid takes things a step too far and throws all the pencils. I always say the kids I work with just get caught. Other kids are swearing. Other kids are breaking rules. They just know how not to get caught. They look for the teacher.
And they know when to stop.
They know when to stop.
Yeah.
Thank you. Absolutely. Whereas my kid doesn't know that. And so they shouldn't get in trouble for not knowing. We need to think, what can we put in place? Because behaviour serves a purpose no matter what. And we don't always know what it is, but we have to come from there. So I love that. Thank you, Elle. Thank you for that. Who else slips under the radar? What other kids?
So I think children whose IQ is not in the category of intellectual disability. So I think children with autism, especially that level 2 and level 3, obviously they still require a lot of support from our school system. And unfortunately, our mainstream school system really tends to follow that like one size fits all approach. And if you think of a child as a puzzle piece, like you can make it fit if you really want, but it's never going to quite fit that system. So I think a lot of people, if you've never raised a family member, or if you've never had a child go through our current education system, you think like, well, these kids need a lot of support. Maybe they should be in a specialized school setting. And you know what? For some children with autism, that's probably right. And absolutely they'll benefit and they'll thrive in a specialized school setting. But a lot of special schools require a child to also have a diagnosis of an intellectual disability in order for them to even be considered for their limited enrollment spot. So that, just to break that down, that means their IQ needs to be below 70. But most children with autism actually have an IQ well above 70, most are average, if not high average and superior. So that's the really, really big problem. They don't belong in that specialized school setting, but the mainstream school setting is ill-equipped to foster their learning. So for these kids in particular, there's this common misconception that they're not thriving and they're not social and they don't know what to do, but that just couldn't be further from the truth. They're desperate for supports and they're desperate to make friends. And, like we were just saying with the pens throwing, same thing in the playground. My brother, I remember at school, was so desperate to make friends that he'd just run up and grab the basketball and run away with the ball at lunchtime. And the school, again, misunderstood that as him just being silly and him wanting to irritate his peers. But if he had a little bit more support, it would have been really clear that he was just trying to fit in.
Totally. And I see this all the time where people misunderstand, and it's the fact he's grabbing the basketball tells me a lot about him wanting connection
Absolutely.
with his peers. And I agree. And I do feel for schools because
for sure.
I'm one of those teachers and I can see the potential, but I just don't have time. And
absolutely.
One of my students many years ago, bless him, he was super smart, but he was also a social justice minister. So he says, everything he had, and he was very mathematical, so everything was math. So he said to me one day, Sulaki, I come to school for 6 hours a day. And I'm like, well, yeah. And he's like, well, that means that, and then I said, we're going to take out morning tea and lunch. So we're in the class for like 5 hours. And he's like, okay, so 5 hours a day. And there's 30 kids in the class. That means you've got 2 minutes for me every hour.
Oh.
2 minutes an hour. He goes, that's 10 minutes a day. And he had a little timesheet.
No.
And serious. Turned out his timings weren't always right. He was actually creating a little every time. It might have been like a behaviour, but his point was right.
Absolutely.
I had 10 minutes of one-on-one time with him. He didn't have a teacher aide. And some days I didn't have 10 minutes because I had other students that needed me. So often as teachers, we write these IEPs that are just unrealistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, for him, actually, we would have been better off spending that 10 minutes a day in the playground and creating social connection, because if he came in anxious after play, actually I was spending a lot of time with him, talking him through social challenges that he had and trying to build his skills around that rather than learning. And this is the frustration. This is the frustration that parents and teachers face, and why I'm so thrilled that you've sort of highlighted some of the things we see every day. And, you sound like me, but very realistic that we do have a lot of challenges and there's no easy answers, but just being aware of that and aware that there isn't a perfect system. I mean, we have to be really eclectic, and a lot of my listeners are in regional areas who don't even have a special school, so being aware of that. Is there anything else you want to share with us today?
I think just being mindful as well that a lot of kids, in regards to slipping under the radar, just because a child with autism is quiet in the classroom doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going okay. And I think, like you said, teachers have 30 kids in the classroom. If a child's not misbehaving and a child's doing what they should do, then great, let them be. But a lot of the time it's when those kids get home that they're just having a full-blown meltdown. And I think a lot of the time when parents then approach the schools and say things like, something's happening at school because when he gets home, this is what we're seeing, the school can, often think, well, oh no, that must be happening at home because he's fine here. Whereas it's actually like an accumulation of things that have happened throughout the school day that are contributing to the meltdown at home. And this is all before, you've even attempted homework, attempted bath and dinner and all of that. So I think one of the main things I am so passionate about is, like I said before, it should never, in the world of autism, in the world of any child, but especially with autism, it should just never be like us versus them. It should just always be like, let's all come together and let's, collaborate and figure out what's going on and how can we all contribute to this child's emotional well-being and mental health.
Absolutely. And that veneer of coping that many of my students do, and particularly that group we're talking about, the level 1, those kids who have enough masking skills to get through the day, and then the straw that breaks the camel's back, and my girls. And we have to realise if they're going home doing that, and some people do that at work. They smile at their boss all day and then go home and cry. So it's no different. And we have to remember we all do that. And it is that student, we need to unravel it and work out what it is. Now, again, some teachers will be saying, so I don't have the time. Yeah. I think sometimes it's not, it's very quick. Like, I mean, I had one little boy, it was working out that the phys ed teacher let children do that, selecting the teams. Yeah. And he was always last to be chosen. Yeah. So he had meltdowns on those days when he got home because of the anxiety. And the phys ed teacher was amazing. I went to him, explained what was happening, and he actually would put up on his window on a whiteboard in the morning who the groups were going to be for phys ed that day.
Oh, so much better.
So much better. So my little boy knew there wasn't going to be that captain's pick. Yeah. He knew what group he was in. And it was, but can you imagine the anxiety that built up all day for him?
For sure,
and standing, we all remember that standing, waiting for you.
I know, so uncomfortable.
And there's no educational outcome in that.
Yeah, literally.
To prove who's popular. Well, great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that isn't a life goal, So absolutely. Oh my goodness, we have covered so much. I definitely want to get you back on to talk about siblings at some stage.
Sounds great.
I will put in the notes your research and let people know how to connect with you beyond today, because I know you're a wealth of information and people can go to your website and learn more. And I just want to thank you for sharing and just helping us understand some confusions and misunderstandings. And if people have any questions, I'll get them to send them in, and I'll maybe we'll do a follow-up, because I just think we've covered so much on this confusion. So thank you so much for your time.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I hope you've got some great tips and strategies to make a difference. Remember, strategies wear out and not every strategy works for everybody. If you're ready to dive in deeper to more strategies and ideas to make a difference, I'd highly recommend you consider Dr. Tony Attwood or my online courses. For more information, visit my website www.sulaki.com.au.